Our first EdVision speakers have a fair bit to say about education, and rightly so. President George W. Bush and Secretary Margaret Spellings were at the forefront of great efforts to improve education, particularly for our most at-risk student groups. They led when it mattered. They built coalitions across the aisle. They enshrined measurement and accountability into education policy at the federal level. They were willing to stake political capital on good ideas. And the result is that millions of students received a better education and more education opportunities than they would have otherwise. What's incredible about them is that they are still in the game, working hard to transform education for young people in the 21st century. Of course, I'm not surprised, especially in the case of my brother. I know where he gets his commitment to this issue. It comes from the heart, it comes from the head, and it comes from being raised by a mother who never stopped telling us that we should fill our heads with something useful, like books. So she got us reading and thinking, and it never stopped. After serving as cabinet secretary, Margaret was president of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's now president of Texas 2036, an organization working to make sure that as Texas prepares to turn 200, that it continues to be a place of discovery, exploration, and possibility. This promises to be a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say about how education policy was a cornerstone of their agenda, how measurement and accountability led to rising student achievement, and what work lies ahead for state leaders today. Please welcome my brother, President George W. Bush, and former U.S. Secretary of Education and President of Texas 2036, Margaret Spellings.
Margaret, it's great to be with you.
You too, Mr. President.
I don't know if the people listening know our history, but you and I have spent a lot of time together.
Indeed we have.
And I'm better for it.
As am I.
And we thank Brother Jeb.
Yes, we sure do.
He's a fine lad.
He is, and he's kept the fire burning on education for a long, long time.
He had an excellent record as governor of Florida, and he is a committed citizen to educational excellence. And for that, Jeb, Margaret and I are grateful. Little concerned about the name Palooza, but it's catchy.
Yeah, exactly. It's very modern, Mr. President.
It is. Well, I'm not, since I had no idea what it meant. But anyway.
Anyway, well, it's terrific to be here. And as you say, we have worked together on these issues for a very long time. So I think a lot of people don't know how all of this has come to be. And so let's have a little history lesson here and review your own thinking about being governor of Texas and the genesis of the nurturing of the policies that became No Child Left Behind. So, you were governor of a big state, this state here. We're sitting here in Dallas, Texas. Why is education so important to governors? And
well, it's interesting. I first met you because you were involved with education.
That's right.
And I ran against Ann Richards in what seemed a seemingly impossible race because of education. It first started off, the funding issue was based on the lottery, and yet the lottery was not going to education, which was irritating.
Yeah.
Secondly, there was something amiss in that too many kids weren't learning. And then so I made education a key platform. I thought it was a civil rights issue in that many of the children who weren't learning, his parents didn't speak English as a first language or were inner city kids. You and I teamed up to develop an agenda to deal with it. And one of the reasons I won was because we had a positive platform with education as one of the focuses, if not the main focus. Now, I used to say education is to a state what national defense is to the federal government, by far the most important priority. And thankfully, I had a group of smart people around me who helped develop an accountability system that would determine whether or not schools were working and what children were learning or not learning. And so that was the beginning.
Yeah, and you talked about, I remember when you met Nelson Brown, the teacher, HISD social studies teacher, who's now gone to glory. Tell that story about visiting with him.
I remember sharing that story with you because I was so struck by the inadequacies of our education system in Texas. I'm moving around the state. This was a school, inner city school in Houston, and there was a geography teacher named
Nelson Brown.
Yeah. And I said, it must be great to teach geography kind of a throwaway line. He said, it stinks. I don't know if he used the word stink, but that's kind of what he meant.
Right.
And I said, why? He said, my kids can't read. Now, this is a high school teacher.
Right.
And it shocked me. And therefore, we began to not only focus on accountability, but we also focused on reading.
Exactly.
Because it became very apparent that the Texas schools were not doing the basics, which is teaching kids to read. And so under your help, we had a huge reading initiative. And as you recall at the time, there was a debate on whole language versus phonics.
Still raging, Mr. President.
I hear it is. And we smartly said the best way to determine what works is to measure.
Right.
Set goals, and if schools are achieving those goals, use the curriculum they're using. If schools aren't achieving those goals, reassess.
Right.
In other words, the accountability system became a way to kind of adjudicate the debate.
Exactly.
Between whole language and phonics. And you know what's amazing, Margaret? It worked.
Absolutely. And that became the platform for No Child Left Behind. I remember I said that I went to the Bush School of Management because it rings in my ear, when there are too many goals, there are no goals.
Right.
And so we had a very laser-focused program at the state level and, of course, at the federal level around accountability and reading and, those most important things. So that got us into discussions about the federal role and the state role.
Right.
And those debates still rage on now. And it'll be interesting, here we are post-election, to see how that gets calibrated or recalibrated. How do you see the federal role?
Well, before we get to there, one of the things we did was challenge what we called the soft bigotry of low expectations, which basically said, we don't accept the idea that certain kids can't read.
Right.
In other words, it's prejudicial to consign people to failure, and whether that be at the state level or the federal level, people involved in education have to understand that we must raise the sights.
Exactly.
And have optimistic goals. To consign a kid to failure is an admission of defeat or an admission of inherent prejudice.
Bigotry. Yeah.
And so I was very mindful as governor about the need for local control of schools, and therefore we prescribed accountability,
right,
but said you chart the path to excellence. Well, it's the same way for the federal government. There's a debate that says there's no role for the federal government in education, and my response was fine, defund it. I mean, if there is no role, stop funding education. But once you do fund, particularly for poor students, let's determine whether the money we're spending is working.
Exactly.
And the only way to do that is to measure. Hence, No Child Left Behind basically said, when we spend money, we at the federal level want to know whether or not the states and the districts are achieving significant results so that no child is left behind.
Exactly. And to get that done, it was your first thing as president. I remember literally the first week of your presidency, we had 5 events, every day it seemed like. Talk about what it took to get that big law that affected every single school and community in our country done.
Well, first of all, it required surrounding myself with smart people and delegating. As I recall, you were the domestic policy advisor.
I was. That was a high honor.
And
lots of fun.
I also recall you were the one determining the strategy to achieve legislative success. One of the things I did initially, along with Laura, was invite the Kennedys to the White House to see the movie on the Cuban Missile Crisis about Ted Kennedy's brother.
13 days.
13 days, yeah. And you might have been there.
I was.
Okay.
It was amazing.
It was. And they came, and they were very grateful.
Yeah.
But it was, the reason I tell that anecdote is that legislative success requires a lot of personal diplomacy. And we had an objective. And it turned out, we found out that Ted Kennedy had a similar objective. Now, he came about it a different way than we did, but nevertheless, he too wanted the government to be more responsive when it came to making sure children could achieve objectives.
And George Miller, Congressman Miller.
Miller and Boehner.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, people often talk
And
about...
the great Judd Gregg, was he?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The big four. People often talk about the need for bipartisanship, obviously, and outreach to Democrats. But I think what people often overlook in that is that, frankly, you brought people in our party from places they didn't want to do. There was that kind of abolish the Department of Education sort of rhetoric, and talk about working with Republicans.
Well, there's a logic to all that. And I would say exactly what I said earlier. If you want to abolish, make sure you totally defund, and then go back to your districts and say, re-elect me, I defunded the money for poor students.
Right.
I mean, if that had happened, of course, that would have changed the need for the federal government to have measured.
Right.
But it didn't happen.
Right.
Because it was practically impossible.
Exactly.
And so we made that case.
Right.
Secondly, when you campaign on a specific agenda and you establish that as a priority and you win, whether it be a landslide or not, nevertheless, our party knew that this was an objective.
Absolutely.
And by the way, and during the campaign, we spent a lot of time selling the idea.
Absolutely.
I remember going to the NAACP and saying, this is best for you and your members. And it wasn't exactly a thunderous applause, but nevertheless, it was a...
But groups like Education Trust and the civil rights community, I mean, we had this coalition of the business community and the civil rights community.
Right.
And God bless Jeb Bush for keeping that kind of relationship, underneath all of this reform stuff.
By the way, God has blessed Jeb
Yes, he has.
Because both of us had great parents.
Yes, you all did. Let's talk about what the results of No Child Left Behind were.
Sure. Well, in our state of Texas, we had what we call an achievement gap.
Yes, sir.
And it was basically, so in order to understand whether or not a reading program works, you have to disaggregate results. In other words, you have to determine success based upon race, geographics, and because prior to that, all the results were lumped together.
Right. Lake Wobegon.
Yeah. Every school was blue ribbon.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
And so, once you're able to analyze, it then means the prescription is much easier. And so we had a very, in Texas at least, a very clear view about the achievement gap. That there white students were here and African American students here, Latino American students here, but we were able to measure on a regular basis the fact that gap was closing.
Yes, exactly.
And we therefore could go around the state praising educators.
Right.
Many of whom take a lot of grief at the local level.
Right.
But we were able to, hold up examples of success. Same at the federal level. And, and the other thing we did was we focused on NAEP.
Exactly.
Because it meant we could compare across state lines and internationally.
Right. I think people don't appreciate what an important reform that was.
Yeah.
Before you became president, it was about 30-some states and different 30 each administration. And, now we have this thing that really tells us where we are all together.
Yeah.
Not to be a Texas braggadocio, but to remind you, when you were governor, we were in the, mid-30s, or the aftermath of that, the success of, measuring and focusing on reading. And we fell to the mid to low 40s now in our state.
I know it.
What do you see? What do you make of that?
Well, I make that we probably had too many goals. The truth of the matter is, after our time, Margaret, there was too much testing.
Yeah.
And it's back to what you said earlier. There's so many goals, there is no goal.
Yeah.
Well, the goal ought to be simplified again,
and
that is to really focus on early reading. Because once you focus on early reading, then all of a sudden, and the kids can read, then all of a sudden it's much easier to achieve, educational excellence. And so my view is simplify the testing, explain why testing is important, which is one of the purposes of this conference.
Exactly.
And refocus the attention of society on things that matter.
Right.
And what really matters is a kid being able to read at 4th grade.
And in ways the public can understand. What your brother has been a major force in driving grade level report cards for states in that name of understandability for parents.
Yeah.
So A school, B school, not needs improvement, might need improvement, those sort of fungible labels that we often see in education. So,
No, he's good.
it's been an important reform.
It really is. And, part of the education debate focuses on school choice, and I can understand that.
Right.
And it must be really frustrating for certain parents not to be able to get their child out of a failed school system.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to make the case for school choice, you first have to make the case that the accountability system proves that the school district is not improving.
Right. As I like to say, if there's no problem, you don't need a solution.
Exactly.
So here we are in the middle of a pandemic, or God willing, the tail end of a pandemic. Assessment obviously is, upside down now. And a lot of states and districts are doing diagnostic assessments and whatnot. But how do you see testing in this time, this notion of high stakes testing? What should happen in terms of accountability this year?
Well, first of all, I think that that because of the disruption of the school year, that school districts all around the country are going to have to make sure that the I wouldn't say lack of education, but the lack of educational intensity is made up through the following year. In other words, I don't think we're going to get back to kind of standard until there's a catch up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And they're going to have to determine, particularly among the younger kids, what has been missed and how do we catch back up.
Right.
And that in itself will require a certain amount of accountability. But it ought not to be multiple tests. It ought to be laser focused on a few things. So I think the reading accountability matters during COVID, post-COVID, in terms of making sure that districts are able to catch back up, because they're not sure how far their children have fallen behind unless there is some accountability.
Exactly. And the early returns are not good. I'm sure you saw in the recent results here in Dallas.
Well, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I mean, you got working moms, whose kids at home kind of self-educating. And secondly, one of the things that we're going to realize after this is over is that children need to have social interaction.
Exactly.
And we're just going to have to catch up. And, hopefully this vaccine will come to be. And, a year from now, during the EdPalooza, there is a whole different environment. But one thing is going to be for certain, that school districts are still going to have to determine, where their children stand relative to standard.
Exactly. One of the things that we're seeing is, a lot of students are missing from the schools. I mean, our enrollment is down here in Texas, and this is holding up around the country, about 6%. I mean, 250,000 kids that were here in the spring are gone.
I'm not surprised.
And so we've got to go find them and help them catch up.
Yeah, that's going to be the real challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you can hold schools to pre-COVID standards until we're head back to normal and give schools a chance to catch up. But they're going to have to measure to determine where they have to catch up.
Exactly. So if you're, what advice do you have for governors or members of state legislatures in this time as they look forward, not only to the remediation and the catch-up, but the days ahead? We're hearing a lot about workforce and pathways.
Well, I think one of the things we're doing at the Bush Center is to make sure people understand that education is necessary. A good education necessary for pathway to the workplace.
Right.
And but I think that governors should not be intimidated by the accountability debate.
Yeah.
Because it can get noisy and loud. On the one hand, you've got in some places teachers unions that say it's unfair to me, the teacher, to measure. Mm-hmm. And it's like, the student is so hard to educate, therefore you shouldn't hold me to account. That's, in a way, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Right. On the other hand, you've got parents saying there's no role for testing. And a governor or a member of the state legislature has to rise above that noise.
Right.
And lead. This is an issue that requires strong leadership. And secondly, it's important for governors to prioritize education. And if you prioritize education, I mean, it's by far the biggest funding issue for most states.
Absolutely.
And therefore, if you're spending money, you need to know
right.
whether or not the money is effective.
I like to say we need to care enough to find out.
Exactly.
And you know, I think people have been surprised when strong systems of reading and literacy coupled with strong accountability in places like Mississippi,
Yeah.
which have done incredible work
That's
challenging
fantastic.
the soft bigotry and low expectations and all that. There's a lot of good examples.
Margaret, one of the things we're doing at the Bush Center is we developed this new dashboard. You might want to describe it to the Ed Palooza fans.
Well, just as you rightly say, you know, measurement and accountability and transparency is so critical. That's absolutely the case as we think about those transitions from K-12 into post-secondary education and into the workforce. And so just as you all had that great report card for cities and mayors, so now are we looking across the country about how good a job we're doing about connecting our schools into our universities and into the workplace and preparing everyone to be successful there. And so thank you for that. It's next level accountability, it's next level transparency, and we at Texas 2036 pledge to partner with you on that as well.
And right now it's an abnormal period.
Right.
But when we get back to a sense of normalcy, you know, I know Jeb will keep working it. We'll keep working the issue at the Bush Center of a strong accountability system. In our case, by the way, we're focusing on principals, how to hire, how to find and retain good principals.
I used to say, show me a good school and I'll show you a good principal. Show me a good principal, I'll show you a good school.
See, that's why we miss you, because you're a billboard.
I mean, you know, it's just, and you know, show me a good leader and I'll show you a good something, right?
That's it.
So we've talked about the role of states, advice you might have for state policymakers. What advice do you have for our friends in Washington and the new administration and the Congress in terms of federal policy?
You know, it's going to be a major focus of funding. It's always a funding fight.
Exactly, yeah.
And the question is more money going to yield better results? And, you know, history has proven that money doesn't equal results. Money is important, but results are achieved through curricula and goals.
Yeah, high leverage policy.
Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned the Bush Center, and
Yeah.
thank you for continuing to light the fires around these issues. Talk about some of the work you're doing out there in education and other.
Full disclosure,
Yes, sir.
you were Secretary of Education.
Right.
You ran the Bush Center.
Yes.
Therefore,
I have a conflict of interest.
your imprint survives, and for that we're grateful. So what was the question?
Tell about the work of the Bush Center now. I know you all are doing a lot on data. I know you're working on immigration issues.
Yeah.
Of course, have a lot of nexus.
So the Bush
into
Center's,
education.
well, thank you. It's broader than education. I see
Right.
what you're saying.
Yeah.
One of the things we've done, I think will hopefully interest people, is that we've teamed up, and this was your creation, I might add, teamed up with the Clinton Library, the Bush 41 Library, and the LBJ Library to develop a leadership program. Men and women from all walks of life, generally younger than me, which is not that hard these days. No political party, no political bias. They're activists in private sector, public sector, care deeply about America, but they come together to form a cohort to study leadership example, how to be a better leader, and they case studies at our 4 respective libraries.
Right.
And so that's an ongoing program that's been extraordinarily successful. We do the same thing for veteran group leaders, impart leadership skills from what we've learned. We're still focused on helping women on the continent of Africa deal with cervical cancer.
Terrific.
It's been a very successful program,
Absolutely.
I might add.
Yeah.
A lot of veterans programs, wellness programs, transition programs.
Of democracy.
Oh yeah.
Human
of course.
freedom.
Yeah, human freedom. We're not in Freedom Hall, but we have what's called Freedom Hall here because I strongly believe freedom yields peace.
Yeah.
And so we're spending time with helping North Korean escapees, which leads to your initial question. I now remember it.
Federal policy.
No, immigration.
Oh, immigration. Yeah. Okay.
So, Margaret, as you know, since I painted your dog,
Yes. Thank you.
I become a painter, and I've transitioned from pet portrait painter to portrait painter, and I've painted the portraits of 43 immigrants.
Super cool.
We chose the number 43 because I happen to be the 43rd president. to tell their stories, to try to get a rational voice in the immigration debate. The debate has been harsh.
Yeah, we worked on that together at the White House.
We did, and unfortunately could not get it passed because of politics.
Yeah.
Immigration is crucial for our economy, but it's also crucial for our soul.
And so as you sit here at your ripe old age and time to paint and think and observe, what do you say about our institutions, our democracy? We've just been through a challenging campaign together, no matter where you came down.
Yeah, it's challenging, all right, but the number of people who decided to participate was impressive. Democracy is alive and well. It has throughout our history been noisy.
Yeah.
It's I think when it's all said and done, people will be able to look back at this period and say, thank goodness we had the institutional protections. Yeah. And so I tell people the office of president is more important than the occupant.
Yeah, I remember.
We come and go, we presidents.
Yep.
We've got our strengths and we certainly have our weaknesses. But the institution of the presidency protects America in the long term. And I'm confident it'll happen again. And people of prayer pray for whoever the president is.
Absolutely.
And I hope people in our country feel the way I feel, which is we want our president to be successful, whoever the person is.
That's right.
Because when it's all said and done, we're all Americans.
Mr. President, thank you. I pray for you, and I so appreciate the role that I have had in your administrations and our friendship. And so thank you for taking time to visit with us. One more thank you to Brother Jeb.
Oh, yeah.
For continuing to highlight these issues.
Yeah.
And we'll see him at the EdPalooza, maybe in person, next year.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeb.
All right. Thanks, Jeb.